beginning another session of the introduction to the novel. One of the reasons I chose to include Kafka in this course, as well as Stendhal, is that at least 4 Nobel Prize winners, older men who have studied classical literature, said that Kafka had a great influence on their writing. And those included the Egyptian Nobel Prize winner Naguib Mahfouz, Isaac Bashevis Singer, the Yiddish Nobel Prize winner, Octavio Paz, the Spanish Prize winner, and Elias Canetti, who is we'll start again. I'm sorry, I didn't have the microphone on. One of the reasons that we've studied Kafka is that in the study of Nobel Prize winners of literature, a course I also offer, at least 4 Nobel Prize winners in literature indicated that they were greatly influenced by Kafka. That was Octavio Paz in Spain, Elias Canetti in Bulgaria, Isaac Bashevis Singer in Poland and the United States, and Singer, Canetti, and Naguib Mahfouz, the Egyptian. They also indicated that they were influenced by Stendhal and by Robinson Crusoe, but basically Stendhal and Kafka. So I decided if Nobel Prize winners were influenced by these writers, they should be in a course called Introduction to the Novel. I just want to take a moment to mention to those of you, particularly who are outside in the West Houston, North Houston Institutes, and those watching on television, that there's a course not listed in the fall catalog this semester that we are going to offer at the West Houston Institute. It is called Nobel Prize Winners in Literature. So I'm going to pause for a swift commercial, and I'm going to show you what we're going to be offering if you're interested in signing up for this in the fall. Focus. Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, Eugene O'Neill's Drama, Ernest Hemingway's short stories, Camus' The Stranger, Isaac Bashevis Singer's short stories, including Blood and Gimple the Fool, Wole Soyinka the African, his plays, the Nigerian Nobel laureate, Toni Morrison, the last year's Nobel Prize winner, will do the Song of Solomon, and Kenzaburo Oi, the Japanese winner this year, or the 1994 winner, who has a collection of novellas called Teach Us to Outgrow Our Madness. So those 8 works will be offered at West Houston Institute. This is not a television course. This is a course where you'll actually see me real and live, and you'll have a chance to participate. So if you have a chance and you're interested, you sign up for English 3345, Section 10909, or English 7396 if you're a post-baccalaureate or graduate student, at Section 10910. It's 10909, 10910. Well, that's the commercial to let you know a course is being offered comprising writers who were greatly influenced by Kafka. Now, there's a great deal of work that has been done on Kafka lately, and those of you who are engaged in research on Kafka and intend to write about this for the research paper may want to know about some of these works. So if we can look at this, zoom back down. There's a long article in Modern Language Review entitled In Search of the Historical Kafka. It's a review of books written from 1980 to 92, articles and books on Kafka by Richie Robertson. And the titles I'm going to list here are titles that he has listed. Now, about 2/3 of the titles he's listed are in German. So if you read German fluently and you want to write on Kafka, you have a great many materials available. He claims that one of the people who's studying Kafka's texts is Tetsuro Uno, who deals with the influence of Max Brod, B-R-O-D. Max Brod was Kafka's friend, and his works are being published. Then there's a full edition of The Castle, published in Frankfurt, Germany in 1980, in German, and Jost Schmilmeit has done a lot of work in Kafka's text, the best text available. But unless you're familiar with German, these won't be too familiar to you. However, in English, there are some interesting works available. Ronald Hayman has a biography of Kafka. That's Hayman, and it was published in 1981. And this should be an excellent work. Frederick Carl. Frederick Carl has written a number of books in which he has isolated very important thematic ideas. One of his works that's very good is an 18th century work called The Adversary Company. But if he has come out with a biography and a discussion of Franz Kafka, I think you're going to find it's very, very good. And hopefully it's in our library. Some other books worth looking at. Stanley Korngold, Franz Kafka, The Necessity of Form. And then a number of books that show influence. For example, one came out in 1992 called Kafka and Dostoevsky, The Shaping of Influence. The Nobel Prize winners generally listed 3 writers who influenced their lives: Kafka, Stendhal, and Dostoevsky. A few more books to look at. There are a series of essays in Harold Bloom's essays being published by Chelsea House, where he takes a single work and reproduces a number of essays, or has a number of writers complete essays for a text. And The Castle has about 8 essays in a collection by Chelsea House. There are a number of books in this series. They'll have essays on The Castle, on Huckleberry Finn, on classical works like Robinson Crusoe. When you get into the philosophy, when you're discussing Kafka, you can get into the philosophy of religion, philosophy and religion. And one book that's new is by Robert Alter, who is a prolific writer. He has a series of essays describing the Bible, in which writers describe various books of the Bible and analyze them. Robert Alter's Necessary Angels, Tradition and Modernity in Kafka should be worth looking at. Then there are a number of writers who are German and who have written in German. I'm going to give you the names, but not the titles. Claude David, Karl Erich Grossinger, and Paul Heller. Richie Robertson, who did the initial review that we're talking about, has also done a book called Kafka, Judaism, Politics, and Literature. And since we know that Kafka's alienation, to some extent, was the alienation of a Jewish family in Czechoslovakia speaking German, we well understand that not only the experiences that he and his family had, but the reports he was receiving of the Dreyfus trial in France and efforts in England in the Balfour Declaration to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine interested him, and these became some of his concerns in his lifetime, all of which provide provocative material for research papers. Finally, there's another book you can look at. There's a collection of Marxist criticism of Kafka's works. Marxist criticism is oriented towards sociological concerns and class differences. And while the Marxist revolution has died in the autocracy of the collapse of the USSR, the philosophy still has a counterpoint to capitalism and other critical modes of treating population differences. And so if you're interested in that approach, Kenneth Hughes has compiled an anthology of Marxist criticism dealing with Kafka. But Kafka was not a Marxist, believe me. And he wasn't interested, this is a study of Kafka, but it's not Kafka's belief, so don't orient yourself in that direction. Now, one of the things you ought to do whenever you're doing a critical paper of any sort is to discover the correspondence of a writer and see what he has said himself outside of his fiction. Shelkin Classics has published a series of a book called Letters to Felice, in which the letters of Franz Kafka have been compiled that he wrote to his lover. And I'm going to read you some materials from these letters to get an idea of what Kafka was thinking and what he was doing. He says, April 4th, 1913. For the past month or two, a Czechoslovakian writer, has been living next door to us. He is a teacher and author of erotic novels. At least this is the subtitle of his most recent book. And on the title page, there's a picture of a lady juggling with burning hearts. I think Burning Hearts is also the title of the book. I don't really know why. I always picture this man, without concerning myself with him in any way, as a little black creep. We pictured him as a creep. And then the other day, I heard a Czech novelist make some remark about our neighbor that was by no means contrary to my idea. He said that erotic novels were written by a dried-up little teacher with no experience in the world, and from his little hole in the ground are bound to be somewhat ridiculous. Just now in the elevator, I met him face to face for the first time. What a magnificent, enviable man. The Czechs, you know, are very much inclined to emulate the French. And he found that there was this man, not a dried-up, indifferent person whom he had imagined would have written such a novel, but a man with a natty French goatee, a slouch hat straight from Montmartre, the fashion place, and a flowing overcoat over his arm, and pleasant, engaging movements, a lively expression, a pleasure to behold. So what you see in your mind isn't always what you're going to see. Writing to Felice, he says, My dearest Felice, you can see how much I need your letters by the mere fact that each time there is no news, in itself a disaster, some further disaster befalls me. It is up to you to prevent this. I really was sad today. Again, no letter. And to tell the truth, for weeks past, I've been delaying my morning departures for the country so as to be able to pick up the confidently expected Sunday letter as soon as possible. One more, and then we'll move on to the discussion of the novel for today. I wrote and told you everything, Felice, that came into my mind at the time of writing. It is not everything. Yet with some perception, one can sense almost everything. I'm not saying that I am happy. I have too much anxiety and too many worries. Anyway, I may be quite incapable of human happiness. He says, I may be quite incapable of human happiness. And the phenomenon that you with whom I felt a bond from the first evening, that you and I should now be completely united, is really inconceivable. He already knew that he had tuberculosis. It makes me want to lean against your breast with eyes closed. Today, Felice, another letter, July 8th. No one can say we have joined hands thoughtlessly. What influenced us was not proximity, which can be misleading, not a moment which can be misleading, not a word which can be misleading. By now, Felice, can't you see what you have actually done and what you are still at liberty to undo? It's not impossible, but the relationship cannot lead to a marriage. He says here, if need be, he says, I have to remain locked up within myself. I'm not a human being. I'm capable of tormenting you cold-bloodedly, you whom I love most, whom I love alone out of the entire human race, and cold-bloodedly allowing you to forgive the torments I inflict. Can I tolerate this situation when I am in a position to see it so clearly, have suspected it, find my suspicions confirmed, and continue to suspect it? If need be, I can live as I am, my rage turned inward, tormenting only by letter. But as soon as we lived together, I would become a dangerous lunatic fit to be burned alive. The havoc I would have to create. And if I didn't create it, I would be more lost than ever, for it would be against my nature. You have no idea, Felice, what havoc literature creates inside certain heads. It is like monkeys leaping about in the treetops instead of staying firmly on the ground. It is being lost and not being able to help it. What can one do? As you begin reading The Castle, you get the impression that people find themselves in situations where nothing they can do can either repair or alter their circumstances. To some extent, those of you who saw Pulp Fiction, the movie, and liked Pulp Fiction, liked it because plots convoluted into plots. And to some extent, it wouldn't be unfair to say that Pulp Fiction was a Kafkaesque movie, because you found odd characters in situations taking attitudes that released them from responsibility for actions that they themselves were committing. But it's interesting that the plots of Pulp Fiction convolute so that when you see one moment, you're actually in the middle of another plot. And the plots keep coming in on each other until all the parts come together. So it should not come as a surprise, however, that Kafka anticipates this technique. And when you see at the beginning of the novel that Barnabas is a messenger and brings a message to Kay, you only realize in the 18th chapter, almost at the end of the book, that Barnabas is trying to resurrect the Barnabas family, trying to restore their place in society, trying to remove the curse that Amalia's refusal of the secretary brought upon the family. And it's not until very late in the novel that we discover that Barnabas, who no longer can repair his shoes because his family has been cut off from society by the disdain of the castle, has insinuated himself into the castle, has got himself a job as a minor functionary delivering messages, has gotten this marvelous message to deliver to the new man in town, and who delivers it at the beginning of the novel, a situation intended to reinstate Barnabas' family, a point we learn about only very late in the novel. So in fact, Pulp Fiction, if it is a unique movie, and it is, and it's gotten the attention of a lot of people who found it a fascinating piece of directing and editing, may even be correct in saying that the technique one ought to attribute to Kafka in the castle. What I'd like to do for the evening is to go through these chapters one by one and to try to identify the critical moments that constitute and comprise this unique convoluted piece known as the castle, as characters come in on characters, and as the statements people make have bearing later on statements other people make. But even before we do that, I want to remind you that this course is an introduction to the novel. Our purpose here is not to be a philosophical course, nor are we a religious course, nor are we a rhetorical course, until we get into the novel and find out what Kafka wants to say. But we have an interesting advantage here. We can see how Kafka actually wrote this book and what changes he made. If you look at the very first chapter, turn to the first chapter. And watch how this book opens. It opens with the phrase, "It was late in the evening when Kay arrived." I'm going to, while I'm reading this, there's another passage that's in the back of your book at page 418. And this was one beginning of the book. The book begins. It was late in the evening when Kay arrived. The village was deep in snow. The castle hill was hidden, veiled in mist and darkness. Nor was there even a glimmer of light to show that the castle was there. On the wooden bridge leading from the main road to the village, Kay stood for a long time, gazing into the illusory emptiness above him. Then he went on to find quarters for the night. The inn was still awake, and though the landlord could not provide a room and was upset by such a late and unexpected arrival, he was willing to let Kay sleep on a bag of straw in the parlor. Kay accepted the offer. Some peasants were still sitting over their beer, but he did not want to talk. And after himself fetching the bag of straw from the attic, he lay down beside the stove. It was a warm corner. The peasants were quiet, and letting his weary eyes stray over them, he soon fell asleep. Well, here's the version that he rejected, and you have it in the back of your books. I just want to bring it to your attention. The landlord welcomed the guest. A room on the second floor had been got ready. The royal apartment, the landlord said. It was a large room with 2 windows and a glass door between them. It was distressingly large in its barrenness. The few pieces of furniture that stood about it in it had strangely thin legs. One might have thought they were made of iron, but they were made of wood. "Kindly don't step out on the balcony," the landlord said when the guest, after he had looked out of one of the windows into the night, approached the glass door. "The beam is slightly rotten." The chambermaid came in and busied herself at the washstand, at the same time asking whether the room was warm enough. The guest nodded. But though he had up to now found no fault with the room, he was still walking up and down, fully dressed in his overcoat, with his stick and hat in his hand, as though it were not yet settled whether he would stay here. Now, just ask yourself in a moment, why do you suppose Kafka rejected that beginning and accepted this beginning, the one you have? Since we have both before us, and we know that there are sections of this book that have been added and subtracted from, since it was not a finished book, why would you surmise the beginning he now has in place is better than the one we just heard? Do we have viewers in West Houston Institute tonight? And if you're there, let me know your names. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How about North Houston Institute? Well, I hope that you're watching on television then. Yes, Ms. Corcoran.
Maybe because there's more confusion in the first one, the one that's actually in the book. In the second one, they're expecting him, and they knew he was coming, and they had the room ready for him. But in the first one, it's confusion right off the bat. Nobody knew he was coming, and they weren't expecting him.
Yes, I think that's a very good point. There's more of an element of surprise, and the fact that he has come without preparation suggests that he's not going to have good accommodations. Right. Yes, Ms. Kerr.
I also seem to think that there's a change in emphasis, that the first version, the emphasis is much more on him, whereas the first paragraph of what was actually used in the book, it's on the castle and on the illusory, like it says here, the illusory emptiness and the mist and the darkness that's shrouding the castle, which that isn't even part in the beginning or in the other version.
Right. He gets us right into the illusion. He gets us into the mist. He makes us immediately aware that there's this imposing structure that for the rest of the novel will always superimpose itself upon the characters and their sensibility. The other problem with the second and rejected beginning was that Kay is in control. He's in the room and he says, I have not yet decided whether I'm going to stay here. And in no time in this book is Kay in control. So that's another reason for the rejection. And having the opportunity to analyze in this shocking text we have the parts that have been accepted and the parts that have been rejected gives us some insight into the way one constructs a novel, and specifically the way Kafka developed his novel. Well, last week we discussed a number of issues in the castle. So this week we're going to start at chapter 10. And we're going to go from chapter 10, if we have time, all the way through chapter 20. Now I'm going to follow this chronologically, primarily because it's one technique that we can follow, and some of you who have read all the way to the end will have some of the answers. Those of you who are still plowing through the novel will recognize the moments of insight that Kafka provided you, or that you discovered once you became familiar with the novel. We're at the moment of the school, and let's see what's happening in the 10th chapter. Turn first to page 153, and we'll walk through it. Kay finds himself on the street. He has already been annoyed with the assistants. He has tried to get rid of his assistants. And on page 153, he sees lights coming toward him. The phrase is, the lights came in the darkness, roaring around him. Why did Kafka write this phrase? Because he feels as though he is in a maelstrom. He's in this situation where he cannot get to the castle. He has been assigned the job as a janitor. His work as a land surveyor apparently has had no response and has had no responsibility, and he has nothing to do. And so in chapter 10, here comes a lantern toward him. And it is Barnabas. Barnabas is coming to him with a letter. Go to page 155. Oh, I'm sorry, page 154. Barnabas steps out, cried Kay. Have you come to see me? To see you, replied Barnabas, with a letter from Clam. Now, at this point, we know why Barnabas is coming, because we read up to chapter 18. But what does this letter have in it? This is the letter that Barnabas, that Kay was waiting for. And Kay folds a large sheet to protect it from the wind while reading. It's a stormy night. And he reads this. To the land surveyor at the Bridge Inn. The surveying work that you have carried out thus far has been appreciated by me. The work of the assistants, too, deserves praise. You know how to keep them at their jobs. Do not slacken in your efforts. Carry your work to a fortunate conclusion. Any interruption would displease me, For the rest, be easy in your mind. The question of salary will presently be decided. I shall not forget you. Now, number one, he really hasn't been involved in any surveying work. Number two, he's tried to get rid of his assistants and locked them out of the school. One of them is freezing out there, Jeremiah. And we discover later on that they're so upset with him that Arthur goes to the castle to complain about the surveyor. Salary, he's apparently receiving salary, but no negotiations have been finalized. And the letter seems to have nothing to do with what Kay has been doing, nor does it seem to have any reality. It is an ideal letter. And the idea of ideality suggests that we are thinking about what we would like to do. The letter from Clam indicates what he would like to have had the surveyor do and what the surveyor would have liked to have done. But it's not true. I'm reminded about an episode some years ago where someone, well, it happens frequently, people will send letters to the White House. And secretaries at the White House have a mechanism whereby they look at a letter and come out with a computerized response. But if the computerized response happens to be the wrong number or the wrong letter, the recipient then gets a wrong letter back from the White House. And one woman wrote to talk about the White House's need to honor her great-great-grandfather, President Polk. And the letter came back, we will investigate the discrepancy in your income tax. Now, I'm sure she would like, under any circumstances, discrepancies in her income tax to have been investigated, or to be investigated, but not when she wrote a different letter. So here we have a letter coming from Clam, which seems to be totally indifferent to reality. Then we have the request on page 158 for a personal interview. This is the message that Kay wants to deliver to Clam. The land surveyor begs the director to grant him a personal interview. He accepts in advance any conditions that may be attached to the permission to do this. He is driven to make this request because until now, every intermediary has completely failed. In proof of this, he advances the fact that till now, he has not carried out any surveying at all, and according to the information given him by the mayor, will never carry out such work. Consequently, it is with humiliation and despair that he has read the last letter of the director. Now, Barnabas has to return this message. Kay had forgotten himself while he was speaking, Kafka tells us. The letter has grown longer than he thought. Barnabas, he scribbled it on a scrap of paper on one of the assistants' backs. And the whole thing is turning out to be somewhat of a bad experience. Barnabas isn't going to deliver the letter. Kay asks him, couldn't you take my message to the castle? And we find out that Amelia, Barnabas' sister, is not allowed into the bureau. She could deliver it. So in other words, the message has been delivered. we find an ambiguous situation where the response message may not be delivered. We discover that Barnabas considers himself a hero, having made contact between the castle and Kay. He's actually delivered this message. There has actually been communication between the castle and Kay. And yet, the frustrating experience is that the return message may not be delivered. We move on to the 11th chapter, where Kay now discovers that he is the janitor in the classroom, in the schoolroom. That's his job. That's where he's been assigned. The classroom is cold, and he and the assistants have to sleep overnight there. He's not by himself. He's with Frida. Page 164. Frida is with him after having been at the Herrenhof and the Bridge Inn. Now, the experience at this point, we discover, is somewhat traumatic. Frida, who has fallen in love with Kay, and Kay, who has fallen in love with Frida, are now together at the inn. Two things concern us. Number one, ultimately, we realize that one of the reasons that Kay wants to be with Frida is because Frida has been Clem's mistress. And so there's the possibility he can get to the castle and he can get to Clem through Frida. By the same token, Frida, having left the inn and having left the Herrenhof, having left the Bridge Inn and the Herrenhof, is somewhat anathema in the community now. She has not only been the whore to Clem, but she's now the whore to Kay. We'll discover that there's one person who's delighted that Frida has left, and that is Peppy, the chambermaid. And we'll move on. For those who want to follow a Marxist interpretation of the castle, the discussion of Peppy and her attitude and the attitude of chambermaids is profoundly interesting and important. In this classroom, which Kay now has both his bedroom and his workplace, we find the arrival of the teacher at page 168, and at page 169 we discover the differences between the personalities of Kay and Frida. It's kind of interesting to see what we see on page 170. No one could think about breakfast. Why? There are differences between these people, and the assistants have to be taken care of. Frida has to be taken care of. But we discover that Frida was to be spared as much as possible the traumas of living with this situation. For she had ambitions, and he had none. This is on page 170. For she had, about midway down the page, for she had ambitions and he had none. She was sensitive and he was not. She only thought of the petty discomforts of the moment, while he was thinking of Barnabas in the future. Frida followed all instructions implicitly and scarcely took his eyes from him. Now, if you were to analyze the different personalities, how successful is this marriage going to be? If opposites attract, it's going to be very good. But we'll find out eventually that Frida becomes disillusioned when she discovers that Kay is interested in the closest access to the castle. And when she no longer suits that purpose, he moves on to his interest in Olga and the Barnabas family, whom he thinks are messengers for the castle. And that's one of the ironies of this novel. When he meets Barnabas and he realizes that this family has a messenger in it who communicates with the castle, then he leaves Frida, who has access to Clam, and goes to a family thinking it has access to Clam, only to discover that it is under the curse, Sortini's curse, because Amalia refused to answer positively the messenger who had given her Sortini's obscene letter. This is what we talk about being Kafkaesque. It seems so weird and anomalous, and yet situations like this are being played out every day. At least you pick up the newspaper and you see them being played out every day in odd circumstances. So we have a situation where there are, at this point, Kay and Frida are together. And it's actually, I suppose, Kay's fault that Frida leaves him, because he thinks he's getting an advantage when he's not. He's playing all the wrong cards. But he couldn't possibly know. And one of the theological concerns in the novel, of course, is whether anyone knows what kind of cards he's being dealt, and anyone knows whether the behavior of him or her or the family are fulfilling the wishes, the religious wishes they desire to follow, or actually controverting the religious principles they ought to follow. Page 171 is kind of an interesting episode with a cat. She called Kay over to the table and showed him the paw, and before he could get a look at it, gave him a whack with a leather strap over the back of his hand. The tails of the strap were blunted, it was true, but this time without regard for the cat, she had brought them down so sharply that they raised bloody wheals. And now go about your business, the teacher says impatiently, bowing herself once more over the cat. Frida, who had been looking on with the assistants from behind the parallel bars, cried out when she saw the blood. Kay held up his hand in front of the children and said, "Look, that's what a sly, wicked cat has done to me." He said it for the children's benefit, whose shouting and laughter had become continuous. But the response had come because the cat had leapt on Frida when she was sleeping. She was sleeping with Kay, and she didn't know, suddenly she felt a beast on her. She jumped up and ran out of the bed of straw. Kay, being asleep, didn't know what was happening. One of the assistants, seeing the opportunity to sleep in that warm bed, fell asleep on the straw next to Kay. When he wakes up, he sees his assistant next to him and doesn't know where Frida is. In the meantime, Frida has some welts from the cat that had jumped on her, and in the activity, the cat's paw itself had been bloodied. And so we have a kind of comic, grotesque episode in which everything is turning out against plan. They're very cold now in these facilities. The wood is stored in a woodshed, and the question is how to get into the woodshed. Now what we have here is an interesting Kafkaesque episode, because Frida assumes the responsibility of breaking into this woodshed to get the wood to heat the schoolroom. And we get this episode on page 172. What happens, of course, in this whole episode is, again, an odd set of situations, because we know who breaks into the woodshed. We know who carts the wood out. Now, who's going to get the blame for it? Everyone's story is different about what actually happened. So we know on page 172 who broke into the woodshed. Let's look at that very quickly and make sure there's no misunderstanding. Who has dared to break into the woodshed? Where is the villain so that I may annihilate him, says the teacher. Frida got up from the floor, which she was trying to scrub, looked at Kay. I did it, Mr. Teacher. And they said, I did it, Mr. Teacher. I couldn't think of any other way. If the classrooms were to be heated in time, the woodshed had to be opened. I didn't dare to ask you for the key in the middle of the night. My fiancé was at the Aronoff. It was possible that he might stay there all night, so I had to decide for myself. Who broke open the door? Asked the teacher, turning to the assistants. The gentleman, they both replied, pointing to Kay. And so that there might be no doubt, they pointed at Kay. Frida laughed, and her laughter seemed to be more conclusive than her words. Well, what's the response? Last evening, I really did break open the door myself with the axe. It was quite easy. I didn't need the assistants to help me, she says, but when my fiancé arrived later in the night and went out to see the damage and, if possible, put it right, the assistants ran out after him, most likely because they were afraid to stay here by themselves, and saw my fiancé working at the broken door, and that's why they say now, but they're only children. So now there's some confusion. The teacher looks at Frida. So, said the teacher, you've been lying, or at least you've groundlessly accused the janitor. They still remain silent. Then I'll give you a sound thrashing at once. Frida cried, the assistants have told the truth. Flung her scrubbing cloth in despair into the pail so the water splashed on every side, and ran behind the parallel bars where she remained concealed. The woman teacher believes none of it. So it was the janitor, said the teacher, pushing the assistants away. And of course, the reality again becomes an untruth. The confusion as to who opened the door, who brought out the wood, who tried to repair the door, becomes Kafkaesque. What seems to be clearly done at first becomes totally mistaken in the minds of the viewers. On page 175, we have an interesting turn to page 175, you see another situation. The teacher dismisses Kay. Being dismissed from his post, she doesn't believe what's happening. And Kay says he's not leaving. She can't fire him because she didn't hire him. He says, Till I hear the contrary from the mayor's own mouth, I refuse to believe it. I don't accept your notice given so hastily. The teacher says, so you don't accept it? Kay shook his head. Think it over carefully, said the teacher. Your decisions aren't always for the best. You should reflect, for instance, on yesterday afternoon when you refused to be examined. Why do you bring that up now? Asked Kay. Because it's my whim. Once the teacher is proceeding on whim, then you have ambiguity. Then you have the lack of certainty. Then you have the lack of definition. Then you have the lack of an identification of the problem and its solution. Anything whimsical then becomes a sign of authority. The authorities can come and they can go. Later on we discover that the authorities come at night to meet certain applicants and supplicants because the events at night are whimsical. You can either solve them, or if not, they pass and you are indifferent to them. There's a great deal of whimsy, but when the autocracy, when the leadership proceeds whimsically rather than by definition or plan, then we have chaos. And where Kafka in his letter said that he is in this constant tumult, this constant anxiety of life, this constant confusion, this is transferred in the novel to Kay. And this is what we're getting when we look at this novel. Let's move on to chapter 13 and see whether chapter 13 leads us into, or what kinds of situations chapter 13 leads us into. And again, one of the things I'm interested in doing at this point is going through these chapters systematically, because this is the way Kafka wrote the book. Now, each episode becomes more and more traumatic. As we move from single episodes, we start moving into longer movements. And we move into the discovery, three major movements as we move toward the end of this novel that we're going to look at. One is Olga's story, and we discover what happened to Barnabas' family and why they are an anathema in the community. Secondly, we discover Kay, who has an opportunity to meet castle officials by going to the inn at night and by pressing his case. A problem that he doesn't anticipate, or a situation he doesn't anticipate when staying from the evening into the morning, he causes a disruption in the inn. And the third is the episode with Peppy, because as soon as Frida leaves the inn, there's a 4-day hiatus where Frida is no longer in the inn. She goes to the schoolroom to live with Kay. Peppy discovers she has new status, but Frida returns in this 4-day span. So these three major episodes, none of which gets Kay any closer to the castle, become major movements as we proceed to the end of the novel. How we move into these situations and how Kafka extricates us from each of these situations is part of the plotting of the novel, and we'll first of all look at chapter 13. In chapter 13, we realize that Kay has locked out his assistants. On page 178, you get that frenetic anxiety of the assistants locked outside, pounding to get in the windows, plastered against the windows. Soon they appeared in front of the windows of the gymnasium, rapped on the panes, and cried something, but the words could no longer be distinguished. They did not stay there long either. In the deep snow they could not be as active as their frenzy required. So they flew to the railings of the school garden and sprang onto the stone pediment where, moreover, though only from a distance, they had a better view of the room. There they ran to and fro, holding onto the railings, then remained standing and stretched out their hands, their clasped hands, beseechingly toward Kay. They went on like this for a long time. One of the differences in the characteristics of Stendhal and Kafka is that Kafka gives us no descriptions. We have them in frenzy, we have them springing on the pediment, we have them in the deep snow, we have them looking into the room, we have them holding onto the railings, but we don't see their figures, we don't see their faces, we don't hear their voices, we don't see any snowbanks. There's a great deal of ambiguity. Things are happening, events are happening, situations are evolving, problems are developing and materializing, but there is no specificity. Nothing specific is being shown. And I've mentioned a phrase here you may want to use, the surrealistic ubiquity of the assistants. These are surrealistic scenes, these bodies against the window, perched on railings, trying to get in when they've been ousted. As we move into this particular plot, we find Frida becoming much more sympathetic to the assistants. Frida says, I shan't, on page 180, I shan't be able to stand this life here. If you want to keep me with you, we'll have to go somewhere or other, to the south of France or to Spain. I can't go away, replied Kay. I came here to stay. I'll stay here. Now, why would a person who's facing all these frustrations say, I came to stay, I'll stay here? If you're a businessman, you'd say, my business is established. I expect to do well. I've done my demographic studies, and I should be able to succeed. Why would I go somewhere else? If you're a politicist, you'll say, these are the people whom I think I can influence and who will see me rise to power. And if you're a religionist, you can say, I don't have anything else to do. I came here, I was brought into this world. What world am I going to go to? The moon? Because in Kafka's world, the human situation has placed you here, and you've got to endure it. There's no place to go. You're not going to find any better situation in Switzerland. You're not going to find any better situation in the United States or in Russia or in China or in the North Pole or the South Pole. This is your situation. All right. Let's look a little bit more at this chapter. Frida is upset now that Clam is influencing all of the behavior of the people. Who are these assistants? Messengers of Clam, says Frida. Messengers of Clam, repeated Kay, astonished by this designation, though it seemed natural enough at the time. Certainly messengers of Clam, said Frida. Even if they are still, they're silly boys too. Even if they are, still, they're silly boys too who need to have more sense hammered into them. Now, Frida, of course, looks upon them as children. There are others who come into this novel. She says, their eyes, these messengers, their eyes remind her of Clam's eyes. Thomas Jefferson was accused of having a love affair with his slave Sally Heming. But his Federalist opponents said that his real purpose in the various love affairs he allegedly had was to increase the Democratic votes in the country. Charles II was accused of spreading his image through the land. And Clam, or Clams, apparently has also the implication that these messengers resemble him. A little boy comes in, Hans. And we find that his name is Hans Brunswick. He is the 4th grade son of Otto Brunswick. And Brunswick is a cobbler who gives work to Barnabas. Somehow Brunswick has access to the castle. Somehow he gets castle contracts. And somehow Barnabas's father gets work. Barnabas gets cobbling work from this situation. Let's look on page 187. Hans is sitting on one of the scholars' desks, and Kay in a chair on the platform with Frida beside him. Okay. We find out that Hans's mother is ill. Her illness is indefinite. Kay is interested in Hans because Hans' father was allegedly involved in hiring him as a surveyor. Kay has some medical knowledge. On page 190 we discover that he might be able to help Hans' mother. In helping Hans' mother, he might accommodate his interest of Hans' father and somehow gain access to the castle. And this is part of the classroom scene. It was part of the classroom scene. We found out on page 190 that Kay, with some medical knowledge, goes to see Hans' mother and speak with her. Hans at first is very interested in this offer. He's excited with Kay. But his father was very angry with Kay, and he wouldn't let Kay come to the house. Hans engages in a certain degree of intrigue on page 194. And we find at the bottom of page 190, go to 193. Hans is seeking Kay's aid against his father. It was as if he had been deluding himself and believing he wanted to help Kay, when in reality he had been wanting to discover whether, since nobody in his old surroundings had been able to help this sudden newcomer, who had now even been mentioned by his mother, might be capable of doing so. On page 194, Kay, in order to get to Brunswick, has to go through Hans. And if you look now on page 195, Hans would tell his mother, or through Hans, Kay is going to speak to Brunswick, because to some extent Kay is helping to bring Hans's mother back into good health. And we see on page 195 that Kay's arrival in the village must have been welcomed by Brunswick. But then his morose greeting that first day and the dislike of which Hans spoke were incomprehensible. There's no reason to assume why Kay receives or earned Brunswick's anger. We do find here that Brunswick had been hurt simply because Kay had not turned to him first for help, and there were other misunderstandings. Okay. We know that Kay needs to get Brunswick's resources to assist him. And the episode with Hans will gain a little bit of momentum. But we discover now that Kay realizes he must play the game. If he's going to get to the castle, if he's going to get the favor of Hans's father Brunswick, if he's going to refuse, if he's going to move ahead and not backwards, he's got to stop alienating these various forces. And there we have on page 199 that on his side, Kay knew that through too great compliance he would only become the teacher's slave. But within certain limits, he decided for the present to give way to the caprices. For even if the teachers had been shown had not the power to dismiss him, he could make the post so difficult that it could not be borne. Now, to this point, we run into a number of circumstances. We run into the classroom. We run into the alienation of the teacher. We run into the discovery that the young boy can help Kay move toward the castle, or proceed toward the castle, or find favor in the castle through Brunswick. We have a number of situations in which Kay is reaching for straws. Everything he reaches for, he hopes will get him to Clam, and each step moves him farther away from it. When we move into the second half of this session in a few moments, we're going to see these major episodes developing with Frida, with the secretaries, and with Peppy as the novel becomes more and more involved, and at each step, Kay moves farther and further away from his goal of reaching the castle. Nothing works. So let's take a 10-minute break, and we'll be back.